They called her the Barren Woman. In Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory, in the year of our Lord 1873, that was a death sentence of a different kind. It meant you were a cracked plate, a lame horse, a burden. For Anna Whitmore, it meant she was about to be shipped off like unwanted freight to a man nobody had seen in 5 years. A joke. That's what it was. A cruel joke cooked up by the good Christian ladies of the church. "He needs a housekeeper," her brother Samuel had said, his eyes skittering away from hers. "You need a home." Simple as that. The man's name was Jack Monroe, a ghost story parents told their children to make them behave. A man who'd lost his wife and son to the fever and buried himself alive on a ranch 20 miles from anywhere. The perfect place to hide away in embarrassment. The perfect place to send the woman who couldn't give her husband a child. The woman whose husband had then had the decency to die and leave her with nothing but whispers and pity. The joke was this: send the barren bride to the broken cowboy. Two negatives they figured would cancel each other out. They thought they were sending her into silence, into nothingness. They had no idea they were sending her straight into a storm that would change everything. As Anna climbed onto the freight wagon, the whole town watched, not with sympathy, but with a grim, quiet satisfaction. They were watching her exile. Her sister-in-law, Martha, already swelling with another child, couldn't even look at her. The blacksmith paused his hammer. The saloon girls peered through the windows. This was her shame, put on public display. The driver, an old man named Pete Sullivan, finally clicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, and Cedar Ridge began to shrink behind her. She didn't look back. What was there to see? A life that never wanted her? A grave that held the only man who ever had? "Storm's coming," Pete grunted, nodding toward the horizon where dark clouds gathered like a bruise. Anna looked at the bruised sky. Let it come, she thought. What was one more storm to a woman who'd already lost everything? The joke was on her. Everyone in Cedar Ridge was sure of it. But the West has its own way of deciding who gets the last laugh. The rain hit them 10 miles out, turning the trail into a thick, sucking mud that fought the wagon wheels for every inch. By the time Pete pulled up to a rickety wooden gate, the world was a gray sheet of water. "This is it," Pete said, his voice full of a pity he was trying to hide. "Ranch house is another mile up that track. I don't take the wagon further." Anna looked at the path. It was less a road and more a scar, vanishing into the tall, whipping grass. She climbed down, her boots sinking into the mud. Her best traveling dress, now soaked and stained, felt like a lead weight. "You sure about this, Miss Anna?" Pete asked, his voice low. "I could take you back. We could say you changed your mind." She looked back the way they came, toward the whispers, toward the pity, toward being a burden in her brother's house. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is where I'm meant to be." She watched the wagon retreat, a tiny, solitary link to her old life, swallowed by the rain. Then she turned and faced her future. The trunk was too heavy. She'd have to come back for it. Gripping the small carpet bag that held all she owned, she began to walk. The land here felt ancient and angry. The wind howled, tearing at her hair, and the sky pressed down, heavy and suffocating. It felt like walking into the belly of the beast. After what seemed like an eternity, a shape emerged from the gray curtain of rain. A house. It wasn't a home. It was a bunker. Built of thick, weathered logs, it squatted low to the ground, as if hiding from the sky. A barn stood nearby, its door hanging from a single hinge like a broken jaw. Smoke, thin and defiant, curled from the chimney. It was the only sign of life. The front door opened before she reached the porch. The man who filled the doorway was bigger than the stories, taller, broader. Jack Monroe looked like he'd been carved from the same hard, unforgiving landscape as his ranch. His hair was dark and long, streaked with a gray that didn't belong on a man of 35. But his eyes were the color of the storm, and just as empty. He looked right through her. "You're the woman," he said. It wasn't a question. "Anna Whitmore," she replied, lifting her chin. She would not be cowed, not by him, not by this place. He took in her soaked clothes, her straying hair, his face a mask of stone. "You're late." "The storm," she said. "Where's your trunk?" "At the gate. It was too heavy to carry. He didn't say another word. He just brushed past her, his shoulder barely missing hers, and strode down the path into the rain. She stood there, dripping on his porch, a strange mix of fury and confusion swirling inside her. Was he a madman? A brute? She watched his tall frame disappear into the deluge. He was heading for the gate, a mile away, to fetch her trunk. It was the last thing she expected. He returned in a time that seemed impossible, her heavy trunk balanced on one shoulder as if it were a sack of feathers. He set it down on the porch with a soft thud, the gentleness of the action completely at odds with the man himself. He stood back, crossing his arms, rain dripping from his hair onto his worn leather vest. Inside, he said, his voice like gravel. Dry off. The house was worse than the outside. It wasn't dirty, but it was empty. A large main room held a table, 2 chairs, and a cold stone fireplace. A few dishes sat on a dusty shelf. It felt like a place no one had truly lived in for a very long time. It felt like a tomb. Your room is down the hall. Last door on the right, he said, his back to her. He was already busy at the stove, moving with a stiff, practiced economy. It was my wife's sewing room. Cleared it out. His wife, Sarah, the woman who haunted this hollow place. Anna picked up her carpet bag and walked down the short, dark hall. The room was small, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the endless, raging prairie. She quickly changed into a dry dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she came back out, a plate of food was on the table. Beans and cornbread. Eat, he commanded, then took his own plate and went outside, back into the storm, to sit on the porch, as if he couldn't bear to share the same air with her. She sat alone at the rough-hewn table, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the howling of the wind. This was her new life, a table for 2, with 1 chair always empty. She ate every bite. The beans were salty, the cornbread hard, but it was food. It was fuel. She was washing the dishes when he came back inside, bringing the smell of wet earth and solitude with him. We need to be clear, he said, stopping by the door, poised for flight. I agreed to this because the Reverend is a persistent man. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not looking for conversation. I need a housekeeper, that's all. I understand, Anna said, her hands submerged in the soapy water. Do you? His storm gray eyes finally focused on her, and the intensity was unnerving. There's nothing out here, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing but wind and work. Nearest neighbor is 10 miles. You won't see another soul for months at a time. Can you live with that? I've spent the last 3 years being alone in a room full of people, Mr. Monroe, she said, turning to face him. This kind of alone can't possibly be worse. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise? Maybe. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind the emptiness. I rise at dawn, he stated, laying out the rules of their arrangement. Breakfast is at 5, dinner at noon, supper when the work's done. You'll run the house, the garden, the chickens. You'll have the egg money for yourself if you can get 'em laying again. He paused. Any questions? She dried her hands on a threadbare towel. Just one. Why did you agree to this? The truth. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked past her, toward the dark hallway. The ranch is dying, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I can't do it all myself anymore. The Reverend said you were a hard worker, said you needed a place. It's a trade, a roof for your work. A trade, not a home, not a partnership. 2 broken people propping each other up just enough to keep from falling over completely. It was a cold, hard truth, but it was honest. She preferred it to the pity she'd left behind. Then we understand each other, she said. He gave a single curt nod. I'll be in the barn before dawn. Cows ready to calve. He turned to go, then stopped at the entrance to the hall, his back still to her. That room, he said, his voice strained. The one next to yours, the big one. The door is closed. It stays closed. He took a breath. That's where they died. Sarah and my boy Timothy. Fever took them both in the same night. And then he was gone, leaving his ghost hanging in the air between them. Anna stood alone in the lamplight, the weight of his words settling over her. This wasn't just an empty house. It was a graveyard, and she had just been made its caretaker. She blew out the lamp and felt her way to her small room. Through the thin wall, she heard the floorboards in his room creak once, twice, then only the sound of the storm. As she lay in the narrow bed, a strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't hope, it was relief. Here in this tomb of a house with a man more ghost than human, she could finally stop pretending. Her brokenness was welcome here. Her emptiness matched his. The joke was supposed to be on her, but as the storm raged outside, Anna Whitmore felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first month was a silent war against neglect. Anna rose in the cold dark, her breath fogging in the air, and threw herself into the work. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, mended clothes until her fingers bled, and battled the stubborn, weed-choked earth in the garden patch. Jack Monroe moved around her like a shadow. They exchanged only the most necessary words. Coffee's ready. Need more wood. Fence needs mending. He ate most of his meals on the porch, staring out at the vast, empty prairie as if looking for something he knew he'd never find again. But slowly, impossibly, the house began to breathe again. Anna bleached old flour sacks in the sun and sewed them into curtains, their cheerful, faded lettering a small act of defiance against the gloom. She found a patch of wild mint by the creek, and soon the house smelled of something other than dust and sorrow. The chickens, coaxed with scraps and a clean coop, began to lay eggs. Small victories in a silent world. One morning, Jack came in from the barn and set his empty coffee cup on the counter. This is good coffee, he said, not looking at her. It was the first compliment, if you could call it that, he'd ever given. I found chicory root by the creek, she replied, her back to him as she kneaded dough. My mother always said it deepens the flavor. He made a non-committal grunt and left. But the next day when she went to the garden, she found the rickety fence had been replaced. New sturdy posts were sunk deep into the earth, the wire stretched taut and perfect. It was his work. She knew his precise, no-nonsense way of doing things. It was a thank you he couldn't speak aloud. She answered in his own silent language. The next day he walked into the barn to find the chaotic jumble of tools organized. Every hammer, every wrench, every nail was in its place. Hung on pegs she'd hammered into the wall herself. They never spoke of these things. It was a conversation held in actions, not words. A fragile truce between two wounded people. The first crack in his armor appeared on a cold evening in October. She found him on the porch steps, the setting sun casting long shadows around him. He was holding a small piece of wood, turning it over and over in his big calloused hands. It was a half-carved toy horse. I was making it for him, he said, his voice so rusty it cracked. For Tim. Anna sat down on the step below him, giving him space but letting him know he wasn't alone. She didn't say, I'm sorry. The words were useless. Instead, she asked a simple question. How old would he have been? 8, he whispered. Come Christmas. They sat in silence as the sky turned from orange to purple, and the first stars pricked the darkness. He didn't say another word, but he had said his son's name. He had let her into his grief, just for a moment. The next morning, for the first time, he didn't take his plate to the porch. He sat at the table across from her. The silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable. Potatoes need digging, he said, looking at his plate. Before the first freeze, could use another pair of hands. It was the first time he'd asked for her help instead of just expecting it. They worked together in the garden, the cool autumn sun on their backs. Their movements fell into an easy rhythm, a dance of shared labor. He showed her how to sort the potatoes for storage, his scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed the dirt from them. Sarah loved this garden, he said suddenly, his voice quiet. She planted flowers all along the fence, zinnias, marigolds. Said a person needs beauty just as much as they need bread. He paused, his gaze distant. I pulled them all up, after. Couldn't stand to see them blooming when she wasn't here to see them. Anna's hands stilled in the rich soil. Maybe, she said softly, it's time to plant some new ones. Not for her, for the living. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. You're a practical woman, Anna Whitmore. Grief doesn't leave much room for anything else, she replied simply. The first freeze arrived that very night, a sudden, sharp cold that caught them by surprise. Anna woke to ice crystals painting the inside of her window. She hurried to the main room to find Jack already there, hauling in a massive armload of firewood. "It's going to be a hard winter," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "I have to move the herd to the south pasture, closer to the shelter of the canyon." "I'll help," she said without thinking. He started to shake his head, then stopped. "Can you ride?" "I grew up on a horse," and so she found herself on a steady mare named Buttercup, pushing cattle across the frost-hardened ground under a vast pale sky. The work was brutal, the wind a physical blow, but it was exhilarating. She felt alive, useful, in a way she hadn't felt in years. When a young calf broke from the herd, she wheeled Buttercup around with an instinct she'd forgotten she possessed, herding it back with a sharp whistle. Jack rode up beside her, a strange look on his face. "You ride better than well enough." "My father bred horses before he bought the boarding house," she said, patting the mare's neck. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hard riding. "You're full of surprises," he grunted, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. That night a blizzard descended on the ranch, a howling white fury that shook the very foundations of the small house. With the cattle safe, they huddled inside. "No sense freezing in separate rooms," Jack said gruffly, building up the fire in the main room until it roared. "Nights like this, Sarah and we used to sleep by the fire." He laid out two separate bedrolls, one on each side of the hearth, a respectable distance between them. But as the storm raged outside, they talked. For the first time, they truly talked. He told her about his dreams of building a cattle empire, about the day he met Sarah at a barn dance, about the way she laughed. She told him about her quiet, lonely marriage to Thomas, a good man who had faded away from consumption, and finally she told him about the doctor's diagnosis, the words that had branded her, barren. She finished, the ugly word hanging in the air. She waited for him to recoil, to look at her with that familiar pity. Instead, he stared into the fire. "Doesn't make you less of a woman," he said quietly. "Sarah, we lost 2 babies before Tim. Nearly broke her each time. Having a child, not having one. That's not what makes a person whole." Tears, hot and surprising, stung Anna's eyes. No one had ever said that to her before. "What does, or?" she whispered. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the scream of the wind. "Being useful," he said at last, "and maybe having someone to share the load with." The storm blew itself out before dawn, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. Anna woke to the smell of coffee. Jack was already up, standing by the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing against hers. Neither of them pulled away. "The fence in the north pasture will be down," he said. "We should fix it before the drifts get too deep." "We," he had said, "not I." They worked all day in the biting cold, their breath crystallizing in the air. When Anna's hands grew so numb she could no longer feel the wire pliers, he stopped, pulled off his own thick leather gloves, and pushed them into her hands. "I've got tougher skin," he said, waving off her protest. "Just keep working." They rode back as the sun set, painting the snow in shades of impossible pink and orange. They rode in a comfortable silence. Two people who had found a strange sort of peace in their shared isolation. Anna realized with a jolt that they weren't just a rancher and his housekeeper anymore. They were partners. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Jack Monroe smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a small, tired lifting of the corners of his mouth as he looked at her across the supper table. But it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Winter will be long," he said. "We'll manage," she replied. "Together." "Together," he agreed. And in that small, snowbound house, in the middle of a vast and lonely wilderness, something new and fragile began to grow. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a start. The blizzard that had brought them together was just a prelude. 2 weeks later, the real storm hit, a monster that the old-timers would talk about for decades. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world disappeared into a solid wall of snow. The drifts piled up against the house, burying the windows, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight. Keeping the cattle alive was a brutal, relentless fight. They'd take turns battling through waist-deep snow to the barn, their faces raw from the wind, hauling hay, breaking the thick crust of ice on the water troughs. They moved like soldiers in a war against the weather. Their world shrunk to the house, the barn, and the blinding white path between them. On the third night, they collapsed by the fire, exhausted to the bone. Their supplies were running dangerously low. The storm had trapped them before their monthly run to town. Anna made a thin soup from the last of the salted pork and a handful of dried beans. Should have gone for supplies last week, Jack muttered, staring into the flames. I saw the signs. Just thought we had more time. We'll be all right, Anna said, her own stomach aching with a hunger she tried to ignore. It can't last forever. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A sharp crack, followed by another and another. 3 shots, spaced evenly apart. Jack's head snapped up, his eyes instantly alert. Gunfire! The signal, Anna breathed. The universal call for help on the frontier. Could be travelers caught in the storm, she said. Or it could be trouble, using the storm for cover. He countered, already reaching for the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. Either way, we can't ignore it. He started pulling on his heavy coat. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Like hell I will, Anna shot back, standing to face him. His eyes widened in surprise at her tone. Jack Monroe, you listen to me. If it's travelers, they might be hurt. They'll need a woman's care. If it's trouble, you'll need someone watching your back. I am not letting you go out there alone. They stood locked in a battle of wills, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their determined faces. He saw the iron in her spine, the fierce resolve in her eyes, and knew it was useless to argue. He gave a short, sharp nod. Get the shotgun, he said. You know how to use it? My husband taught me, she said, pulling the heavy weapon from its pegs near the door. I'm a better shot than you think. Bundled in every layer of clothing they owned, they stepped out into the white nightmare. The force of the wind was staggering. Jack led the way, a lantern held high, its light a feeble, golden orb in the swirling chaos. Anna followed in his footsteps, the cold shotgun a heavy, reassuring weight in her hands. They followed the fence line, the only landmark in the featureless landscape. The cold was a physical pain, seeping through their boots, their gloves, their very bones. Just when Anna thought she couldn't take another step, a dark shape loomed out of the snow. Horses, 4 of them, huddled together for warmth, their backs to the wind. And beside them, 2 figures. Hello, the camp! Jack yelled, his voice nearly ripped away by the wind. A woman's voice cried out, thick with relief. Thank God! Please, we need help! As they drew closer, they saw it was a man and a woman, both looking half frozen. The man was slumped against his horse, barely conscious. Our wagon broke an axle, the woman explained, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. We got separated from the others. My husband, Ben, he fell. I think his leg is broken. Let's get him inside, Anna said, moving immediately to the injured man's side. Jack hesitated for only a second, his natural caution warring with the unwritten law of the West. You don't leave people to die in a storm. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and took the man's other arm. House is this way. Stay close. The journey back was a grueling ordeal. The injured man, Ben, was a dead weight, and his wife, Mary, was so weak she kept stumbling. But they made it, bursting back into the warmth of the cabin like refugees from a frozen war. Anna took charge instantly, the skills learned in her family's boarding house rushing back to her. Get those wet clothes off now. Jack, more wood on the fire. Mary, help me with your husband. The next hour was a blur of frantic, focused activity. Anna cut away Ben's trousers to reveal a horribly swollen and unnaturally angled leg. Using barrel staves from the kindling box and strips torn from her own petticoat, she set and splinted the break as best she could, her movements swift and sure. Jack, silent and efficient, helped her, his big hands surprisingly gentle as they held the injured man steady. Once Ben was settled by the fire, groaning in a haze of pain and exhaustion, Anna turned her attention to Mary, wrapping her in dry blankets and forcing her to drink hot, sweet coffee. a treasure she'd been saving. "We're the Morrisons," Mary said, her voice trembling. "I'm Mary, that's my brother, Frank." She gestured to the other man, who was helping Jack tend the horses. "And my husband is Ben. We're headed for Oregon. The wagon master. He said the storm wasn't so bad. He pushed on." "He left you?" Jack asked, his voice flat and dangerous. Frank Morrison came inside then, his face grim. "He said he couldn't risk the whole train for one broken wagon. He left us to die." The air in the small cabin crackled with a silent fury. Jack's hand rested on the stock of his rifle. "You're safe now," Anna said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of emotions. "We don't have much, but what we have is yours." As the night wore on, the storm began to lose its fury. They shared what little food they had, the Morrisons contributing some dried apples and hardtack from their saddlebags. Huddled around the fire, they were no longer strangers, but survivors. "You two been married long?" Mary asked, her eyes moving between Jack and Anna. The question hung in the air. Anna opened her mouth to explain the arrangement, to say we're not, but Jack spoke first. "A few months," he said, his voice even. "Still new." Anna's cheeks burned. He'd claimed her. In front of these strangers, he had named her his wife. It was a lie, but it felt more real than the truth. "You're a lucky woman," Mary said with a soft smile, "to have a man who'd go out in a storm like that for strangers." She looked at Anna, then at the way Jack stood protectively near the door. "He looks at you like you're the only thing holding his world together." Later, when the Morrisons were asleep, exhausted in the bedrolls Jack had given them, Anna and Jack stood by the fire. "Why did you say that?" she asked quietly. "About us being married?" He stared into the flames, his profile carved by the firelight. "Didn't seem right to explain our business, not to them. And," he hesitated, "they were looking for a safe harbor. A husband and wife, a family, that feels safe." A crash from the barn cut him off. A loud splintering sound, followed by the panicked whinny of a horse. Jack grabbed his rifle in a single fluid motion. "Stay here," he ordered. But Anna had already snatched up the shotgun. She followed him out the door into the eerie post-storm silence. The snow had stopped, and the moon was a ghostly sliver behind the clouds. In the snow near the barn, a man was trying to untangle his horse from a section of fence it had crashed through. "Don't shoot!" the man slurred, raising his hands as he saw them. "Just lost my way. Saw the light." But something was wrong. His clothes, though torn, were too fine for a simple traveler. His horse was a magnificent black stallion, far too well fed for a long journey. And his eyes, as they flicked from Jack's rifle to Anna's shotgun, were cold and sober and calculating. "My friends were caught in the storm," the man said, forcing a clumsy, drunken smile. "A family. The Morrisons. You seen them?" "They're inside," Jack said, his voice like ice. "Safe." "Thank the Lord," the man said, though his eyes held no relief. "The name's Cole Anderson. Mind if I come in and warm myself before I join them?" Anna felt Jack go rigid beside her. Cole Anderson. The name was whispered in saloons. A boogeyman of the territory. He ran with the notorious Wallace gang, rustlers, robbers, and killers. And he had just walked right into their home. They had no choice. To turn him away would be a death sentence, and even an outlaw deserved better than to freeze. But as they let him inside, Anna knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just entered their house. Cole Anderson made a show of relief, rubbing his hands together by the fire, but his eyes missed nothing. He counted the men, noted the weapons, his gaze lingering on Mary Morrison for a moment too long. The Morrisons, groggy with sleep, looked confused. "Cole," Frank said, sitting up, "what are you doing here?" "Looking for you, friend," Cole said with a wide, predatory grin. "Can't let my new business partners freeze to death. Can I?" Anna's blood ran cold. Frank and Ben Morrison weren't just travelers. They were somehow connected to this killer. The safety of her home had been shattered, and the night was far from over. "Business partners?" Jack's voice was low and flat, each word a carefully placed stone. He hadn't moved from his position by the door, his rifle held loosely but ready. Cole Anderson laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "That's right. Frank here and his brother, they had a little financial trouble back in Missouri. I helped them out. They're just paying me back with a bit of specialized labor out here in the West. Frank Morrison's face was pale. Cole, this isn't the time or the place. Oh, I think it's the perfect time, Cole said, his eyes roaming the small cabin again, assessing its meager contents. Cozy little setup you got here, Monroe. A man could get comfortable. Pretty wife, too. His gaze settled on Anna, insolent and appraising. Jack took a half step forward, and the easy-going mask dropped from Cole's face. The man was a coiled rattlesnake. Easy now, Cole said, raising his hands in mock surrender. We're all friends here, just travelers grateful for your hospitality. But the threat lingered in the air, thick and poisonous. Anna saw the truth now. The Morrisons weren't victims of a wagon master. They were running from this man. The broken axle, the separation from the wagon train, it was all a lie. They were fugitives, and they had brought the wolf right to her door. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. No one slept. Anna made more coffee, her movements deliberate and calm, but her mind was racing. She positioned herself near the kitchen counter, where the heavy butcher knives were kept. Every time Cole's eyes flicked toward her, she met his gaze without flinching. Lot of cattle for just two people to manage, Cole said conversationally, trying to draw Jack out. Especially in weather like this. Easy for a few head to go missing. A man needs friends to help him watch his stock. The implication was clear. Give us shelter, maybe more, and we'll leave your cattle alone. Jack didn't take the bait. My neighbors and I look out for each other, he said, his voice cold as the snow outside. It was Anna who saw the opening. She moved to refill Cole's coffee cup, her voice light and pleasant, as if she were at a church social. Oh, my husband is very particular about his herd, she said with a bright smile. He's known all over the territory for his marksmanship. Won the county shooting competition 3 years straight before he settled down. She paused, letting the lie hang in the air. Why, just last fall, he shot a coyote that was bothering the chickens. From the porch, dropped it with one shot right through the eye, at 300 yards. She had no idea if Jack could shoot that well, but Cole Anderson didn't know that. She saw a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. A man who could make a shot like that was not a man to be trifled with. She saw Jack's jaw clench, but he played along. The whole valley looks out for each other, he affirmed. Good people. Don't take kindly to thieves. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with one of Anna's knives. Frank and Ben Morrison sat like stones, trapped between their rescuer and their tormentor. Mary huddled by the fire, her eyes wide with fear. Dawn came as a reprieve. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the world outside painfully bright. Cole was the first on his feet. Well, he said, stretching like a contented cat, this has been charming, but I best be on my way. Got my own men to find. He walked to the door and paused, looking back at Frank. I'll be in touch. It sounded like a death sentence. He gave Jack a nod. Monroe. Then his eyes found Anna. Ma'am, it's been a pleasure. She didn't breathe freely until his horse was a black speck against the snow. As soon as he was gone, Frank Morrison was on his feet, his face a mask of shame and desperation. We have to leave. I am so sorry. We never meant to bring this on you. Who is he? Jack demanded. He's a devil, Mary whispered from her place by the fire. Back home, Ben and we borrowed money from him. The interest was impossible. He said we could work it off by helping his associates, finding routes for them to move stolen cattle. We ran instead. And he found you, Anna finished. He'll be back, Jack said, his face grim. And not alone. He was scouting, sizing us up. Then we'll be ready for him, Anna said. This isn't your fight, Frank insisted. You've done more than enough. We'll leave now. Draw him off. With your brother's leg? Jack scoffed. You wouldn't make it 5 miles. He'd hunt you down for sport. He looked from Frank's desperate face to Mary's terrified one. He looked at the splint on Ben's leg, the one Anna had made. He turned to Anna, a silent question in his eyes. This was her home too, her safety on the line. They stay, she said without a moment's hesitation. We took them in. We'll see this through. Frank looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was painful. We don't deserve your kindness. Kindness has nothing to do with it, Jack said, checking the action on his rifle. Cole Anderson made a mistake. He threatened my wife and my home. Now we're going to make him regret it. My wife. He'd said it again. This time it wasn't a lie for strangers. It was a declaration of war. They spent the day preparing for a siege. They boarded up the smaller windows. Jack and Frank hauled water and ammunition into the house. Anna and Mary cooked what food they had left, making biscuits and boiling jerky to have something ready to eat. They were no longer four strangers and two hosts. They were a single small unit, bound together by a common enemy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Anna's stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She was no longer a victim, a cast-off. She was a woman defending her home. They waited. The sun crawled across the sky. The shadows lengthened. The silence of the snow-covered prairie was absolute. Just as dusk began to settle, they saw them. 5 riders, dark silhouettes against the orange and purple sunset. They weren't riding fast. They were confident, arrogant. "Get Ben to the back room," Jack commanded, his voice low and calm. "Mary, you stay with him. Frank, you take the side window. Anna, the kitchen window. Don't fire until I do. Aim for the horses first if you can." Anna's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she raised the heavy shotgun and rested its barrel on the windowsill. Through the glass, she could see Cole Anderson leading the men. He stopped just outside of rifle range, a cruel smirk on his face. "Monroe!" he yelled, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I've come back for my friends, and for a little compensation for my trouble. Send 'em out, and we'll leave your cozy little farm in one piece." Jack didn't answer. "Have it your way," Cole shouted. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, showering Anna with glass. The siege had begun. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Anna ducked instinctively as another bullet punched through the wall just inches from her head. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but a strange, cold calm had settled over her. This was real. The whispers and pity of Cedar Ridge were a lifetime away. This was a fight for survival. "Stay down!" Jack yelled from his position at the front window. "Don't waste your shots!" Outside, the 5 riders circled the house, whooping and firing, treating it like a game. They were arrogant, sure of their victory against a lone rancher and his wife. They didn't know about Frank Morrison, who was now a silent, steady presence at the side window, his own rifle ready. "They're trying to draw our fire," Frank called out, his voice tight. "See how many guns we have." "Then let's give them a surprise," Jack said. He took a deep breath, sighted down the barrel of his rifle, and fired. The crack of the shot was deafening inside the small cabin. One of the riders cried out and clutched his shoulder, nearly falling from his horse. "Frank, now!" Jack commanded. Another shot rang out from the side of the house. A second rider's horse screamed and went down, pitching its rider into the snow. 3 left, plus Cole. The game had just changed. Their confident circling turned into a panicked scramble for cover behind the barn and the water trough. "Reload!" Jack barked. Anna's hands moved with a swiftness that surprised her. She broke open the shotgun, ejected the spent shell, and slid a new one into the chamber. The familiar metallic click, a small, reassuring sound in the chaos. The fight settled into a tense rhythm. Moments of terrifying noise followed by long stretches of heavy silence. The sun went down, plunging the world into a landscape of dark shadows and moonlit snow. It made the targets harder to see, but it also made them bolder. Anna peered through her shattered window, scanning the area around the barn. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadow of the building. A man crawling on his belly, trying to get to the blind side of the house. "Jack," she whispered, her voice tight. "One of them, by the barn, moving toward the back. Can you take him?" Jack's voice was low and tense. She took a deep breath. He was far, almost at the edge of the shotgun's effective range. But if he got to the back of the house, he could set it on fire. Her mind flashed to the lie she told Cole. My husband dropped a coyote at 300 yards. Now she had to make a different kind of lie come true. She rested the heavy barrel on the windowsill, aimed just ahead of the crawling figure, and squeezed the trigger. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder, its roar filling the kitchen. The crawling figure jerked and then lay still. Silence. Anna? Jack's voice was sharp with concern. He's down, she said, her own voice sounding distant, foreign. She had just shot a man. The thought was horrifying, but the alternative, letting him harm the people inside this house, was worse. From the front of the house, Cole Anderson let out a roar of pure rage. "You'll pay for that, you bitch!" The attack intensified. Bullets tore through the thin log walls. A lamp on the mantel exploded. In the back room, Ben groaned in pain, and Mary stifled a sob. They were trapped. They had surprised them, yes, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. It was only a matter of time before the outlaws rushed the house. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night. A series of shots, but not from the men outside. These were from far away, from the east, back toward the main trail. "What in God's name?" Frank breathed. Cole and his men heard it too. The frantic shooting from outside stopped. They heard shouted, confused voices. Then the thunder of hoofbeats riding away from the ranch, fast. Jack, Frank, and Anna stared at each other in the dim moonlit room, their faces smudged with gunpowder. Had the outlaws given up? It didn't make sense. Then they heard a new set of riders approaching, slower this time, more deliberate. "Get ready," Jack whispered, raising his rifle again. A voice called out from the darkness. "Hello, the house. This is Sheriff Brody from Cedar Ridge." Anna felt her knees go weak with relief. She stumbled toward the door, but Jack put a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait." They listened as the sheriff and his posse, at least a half-dozen men, dismounted, their voices carrying in the cold air. "Looks like they ran off. Found one of them back by the barn. He ain't getting up." "Good riddance." Sheriff Brody approached the porch. "Monroe, you and your wife all right in there?" Jack finally unbarred the door. The sheriff was a big man with a kind, weathered face. Behind him stood several ranchers Anna recognized, their faces grim and determined. "We're fine, Sheriff," Jack said. "Thanks to you." "But how did you know?" The sheriff pushed back his hat. "Got a strange telegram this afternoon. All it said was, Monroe Ranch, trouble, Cole Anderson. Said it was from a friend." "A friend?" Anna asked, confused. "That's not all," the sheriff continued. "When we were riding out, we ran into Pete Sullivan, your freight driver. Said he was worried sick about you both after that blizzard. Said he had a feeling something was wrong. He was riding out to check on you himself." The sheriff looked past them, into the battered cabin. Looks like his feeling was right. They pieced it together later. Someone, a mysterious friend, had sent a warning, but it was old Pete, the man who couldn't meet her eyes when she left Cedar Ridge, whose simple worry had probably saved their lives. He'd met the posse on the trail and confirmed they were heading in the right direction. As the posse saw to the dead outlaw and checked the property, Anna's mind reeled. Who had sent the telegram? Cole wouldn't have. The Morrisons were cut off. It made no sense. With the immediate danger past, the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She looked around the main room. It was a wreck. Shattered glass, splintered wood, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. But they were alive, all of them. Frank Morrison approached her, his face etched with a gratitude that left him speechless. He simply took her hand and bowed his head over it for a moment before turning to help the sheriff. Jack came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth. He looked at the shotgun she still held, then at her face. "You did good, Anna," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Real good." "We both did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We made a good team." "That's what I meant," he said quietly. "Partners." They stood there in the doorway of their ruined home, watching the posse organize themselves in the moonlight. Something profound had shifted between them during the long, terrifying night. They had faced death together, defended each other, protected strangers. They had forged a bond in the crucible of violence, a bond stronger than any legal document or spoken vow. The town had sent her out here as a joke, but tonight she had fought like a lioness for this place, for this man. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a cast-off. She was home. And God help anyone who tried to take it from her. In the aftermath of the siege, a strange peace settled over the Monroe Ranch. The sheriff's posse stayed for a day, helping to repair the worst of the damage. Their easy conversation and rough-hewn kindness a balm after the terror. They left with promises to keep a closer eye on the territory, and with a newfound respect for the reclusive rancher and his surprisingly formidable wife. The Morrisons, their secret now exposed, were filled with a quiet shame. "We should leave," Frank said to Jack as they replaced the shattered kitchen window. "We've brought you nothing but trouble." "You brought us neighbors," Jack replied gruffly, not looking up from his work. "And you drew the fire of a man who needed dealing with. You'll stay until Ben's leg is healed and you're strong enough to travel safely." End of discussion. And so the small, isolated ranch became a crowded, bustling sanctuary. Mary Morrison, her quiet gratitude expressed in tireless work, helped Anna turn the damaged house back into a home. Frank, a skilled carpenter, not only repaired the bullet holes but also fixed the sagging barn door and the warped porch steps. Ben, confined to his cot, taught Jack a clever way to braid rope for a stronger lariat. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of work, quiet conversation, and even occasionally laughter. Anna found herself humming as she cooked, the presence of other people a comfort she hadn't realized she missed. Jack, too, was changing. The hard, empty look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. A watchfulness, yes, but also a warmth. Anna would catch him watching her as she rocked in the evening, mending clothes by the firelight, a small, unreadable smile on his face. One evening after the others had gone to bed, they sat on the porch, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. "I never thanked you," he said, his voice low, "for what you did during the attack. You don't need to thank me, Jack. I was defending my home." He turned to look at her, the moonlight softening the hard lines of his face. "Is that what this is to you? A home?" "Isn't it?" she asked softly. He looked out at the vast, star-dusted prairie. "It wasn't. For a long time. It was just a place to wait. Now," he trailed off, unable to find the words. "Now it's different," she finished for him. "Because of you," he said simply. The words were a quiet admission, more intimate than any touch. He reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Anna," he began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "When the Morrisons leave, I wouldn't be opposed to you staying on, permanently." Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a business proposal, phrased in his careful, guarded way. But it was more than she had ever expected. "I wouldn't be opposed to that either, Jack," she whispered. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, two solitary souls who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. The knock on the door came just after dawn a week later. It was a frigid February morning, the world outside locked in a hard frost. Jack had gone to the barn. Frank was splitting wood. Anna was alone in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. She opened the door to a nightmare. A young woman stood on the porch, swaying on her feet. Her face was a ghostly gray, her eyes wide with fever and desperation. She was clutching a dirty bundle of rags to her chest. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice a dry rasp. And then her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed. Anna lunged forward, catching her before she hit the unforgiving porch boards. The woman was light as a bundle of sticks. As Anna half dragged, half carried her inside to a chair by the fire, the bundle in her arms stirred and let out a thin, mewling cry. A baby. The sound, sharp and piercing, brought Jack running from the barn, his face a mask of alarm. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes locking on the infant. All the color drained from his face. The ghosts of his past had just walked back into his house. "Get blankets," Anna ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through his shock. "And heat some milk with a little water and sugar. Now, Jack!" Her command broke the spell. He moved, his actions jerky at first, then more sure. Anna gently took the baby from the unconscious woman's arms. The infant was tiny, terrifyingly so, its skin blue with cold. She unwrapped the rags to find a small, pinched face and fists the size of walnuts. Working quickly, she stripped off the baby's damp clothes and wrapped him in a warm, dry dish towel, tucking him inside her own dress for warmth against her skin. The young mother on the chair began to stir, her breathing shallow and ragged. A terrible, wet cough shook her thin frame. Anna saw the telltale specks of blood on her lips. Consumption, and a bad case of it. "My baby," the woman gasped, her fever-bright eyes searching wildly. "My William. He's here. He's safe," Anna soothed, rocking the infant who had begun to warm against her. "What's your name?" "Rose," she coughed. "Rose Sullivan. Came from Kansas. Looking for his father." Her eyes fixed on Anna's face, a desperate plea in their depths. "He's gone. The father. A mining accident. I have no one. No one." She pushed herself up, grabbing Anna's arm with a surprising strength. "You," she whispered, her voice burning with intensity. "I heard about you in town. The woman at the Monroe Ranch. They said you couldn't—" Another coughing fit racked her body, cutting her off. But Anna understood. This woman, this dying stranger, hadn't stumbled upon their ranch by accident. She had sought them out. She had brought her baby to the barren woman. "Promise me," Rose gasped, her grip like iron. "Don't let them take him to an orphanage. Promise me you'll raise him. You'll be his mother." Anna looked down at the tiny, fragile life nestled against her heart. She looked at Jack, who stood frozen by the hearth, his face a battlefield of old grief and new terror. This was impossible. A child, in this house of ghosts, with this broken man, with a woman who was a walking, breathing reminder of what he had lost. But then she looked back at Rose's desperate, dying eyes, and she looked at the infant, William, who had found his way to her in the middle of a winter storm. "I promise," Anna whispered. A faint smile touched Rose Sullivan's lips, and then with a final shuddering sigh, she was gone. Anna was left standing in the sudden, shocking silence, a dead woman in her chair and a new tiny life in her arms. The joke the town had played on her had just taken a turn that no one, least of all her, could have ever imagined. The world tilted on its axis. One moment, Anna was a housekeeper in a quiet arrangement. The next, she was a surrogate mother, holding a stranger's child, with a dead body cooling by the fire. The Morrisons were a blessing. While Jack stood like a man turned to stone, Frank quietly and respectfully carried Rose's body to the cold storage shed, handling the grim task with a gentle dignity. Mary, her own eyes filled with tears, helped Anna. She found old, soft linens for diapers and helped warm the milk, her practical, steady presence a lifeline in the chaos. But it was Jack's reaction that terrified Anna. He wouldn't look at the baby. He wouldn't come near it. He moved around the edges of the room, his face a closed, tight mask of pain. The arrival of this child hadn't just opened old wounds. It had poured salt in them. "We can't keep him," he said that evening, his voice hollow. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a grief so raw, it was like a physical blow. "Anna, we can't. I made a promise," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She was feeding the baby, William, with a makeshift bottle, a small medicine vial with a piece of clean cloth over the top. He was sucking greedily, his tiny hand wrapped around her finger. "You had no right to make a promise like that," he exploded, his voice cracking. "To bring a child into this house? After everything?" "Where else should he go, Jack?" she shot back, her own grief and fear turning to anger. "To an orphanage? To be passed around until he's old enough to be a farmhand? His mother died on our floor, begging me to protect him. What would you have had me do?" He had no answer. He just sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The sound of his ragged breathing filled the room, a counterpoint to the baby's soft, sucking noises. They buried Rose Sullivan the next day on a small hill behind the house, overlooking the vast sweep of the prairie. Frank made a simple wooden cross. Anna held the baby, wrapped tightly against the cold, while Jack read a few halting words from a Bible he'd pulled from a dusty trunk. His voice broke on the words, "ashes to ashes." That night, the Morrisons announced they were leaving. Ben's leg was mending well enough to ride, and they had overstayed their welcome. "We can't thank you enough," Frank said, his handshake firm, "for everything." "You're good people, Anna," Mary whispered, hugging her tightly. That little boy is lucky to have you." And then they were gone, riding off into the vast, snowy landscape. The silence they left behind was deafening. It was just the three of them now. A broken man, a barren woman, and an orphan. A strange, impossible family. The first few days were a tense, silent struggle. Anna threw herself into caring for William, a fierce, protective love blooming in her chest. She had never held a baby for more than a few minutes. She had avoided them, the painful reminders of her own failure. But this was different. This tiny, helpless creature depended on her for everything. He wasn't a reminder of what she couldn't have. He was simply what she had. Jack kept his distance. He worked from sunup to sundown, exhausting himself in the brutal winter chores, as if trying to outrun the ghosts in his house. He ate his meals quickly, his eyes always avoiding the small makeshift cradle Anna had placed by the fire. The breaking point came on the third night. William had been crying for hours, a high, thin wail of colic that grated on Anna's frayed nerves. She had walked him, rocked him, sung to him, but nothing worked. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and felt a desperate, rising panic. "I don't know what else to do," she cried out, tears of frustration streaming down her face. Jack, who had been sitting rigidly in his chair, staring into the fire, stood up. He walked over to her, his face grim. "Give him to me," he said, his voice rough. Hesitantly, she passed the screaming infant into his arms. Jack held the baby awkwardly at first, as if he were holding a bomb. William's cries intensified, his tiny body rigid with distress. Jack closed his eyes. Anna saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Then he began to hum, a low, rumbling, tuneless sound. He started to walk, his long strides pacing the length of the small cabin. Back and forth, back and forth. He held the baby against his shoulder, his big, calloused hand patting the tiny back in a steady, rhythmic beat. Slowly, miraculously, William's cries began to subside. His wails softened to whimpers, his rigid body relaxed against Jack's shoulder. Finally, with a shuddering sigh, he fell asleep. Jack stood motionless for a long time, the sleeping infant nestled against his neck. Anna watched, her heart aching. When he finally turned, there were tears tracking through the grime on his cheeks. "He's so small," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed grief. Tim was bigger than this when he was born. It was the first time he had willingly spoken his son's name, the first time he had connected the past to the present. He looked at Anna, his eyes filled with a terrible, vulnerable pain. "I don't know how to do this again, Anna," he choked out. "You won't be doing it alone," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "We'll do it together." He looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms, then at her. He didn't say anything, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a beginning, a fragile, uncertain truce with the ghosts of the past. The next morning, Jack didn't go straight to the barn. He stayed and held William while Anna made breakfast. Later that day, she looked out the window and saw him in the barn, working on something. When she went to check, she found he was sanding down the half-finished toy horse, the one he'd been carving for Timothy. He was finishing it for William. They knew they couldn't just keep the child. There were laws. They would have to go to town, to face the whispers and the questions, and see Judge Patterson. The trip to Cedar Ridge was an ordeal. Anna sat on the wagon seat holding William, feeling the weight of every stare. The townspeople who had pitied her for being childless now stared at her with a new, suspicious curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, the town's chief gossip, cornered her outside the mercantile. "Well, Anna, where on earth did that come from?" she asked, her voice dripping with insinuation. Before Anna could answer, Jack stepped in front of her, his big frame a solid wall between her and the woman. William was bundled in a sling against his chest, fast asleep. "His mother was ill," Jack said, his voice cold and flat. "She needed help. We gave it. She passed. We're raising her boy now." He stared Mrs. Henderson down. "Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The woman sputtered and retreated. Judge Patterson, a kind man with wise eyes, listened to their story patiently. He looked at the baby, then at the way Jack and Anna stood together, a united front. "Rose Sullivan had no known kin," the judge said, shuffling through some papers, "and her dying wish was for you to raise the child." He looked at them over the top of his spectacles. A child needs a home. It seems to me he's found one. I'll draw up the adoption papers. William Monroe. It has a nice ring to it. They left the courthouse in a daze. It was official. They were a family, not in the way they'd ever imagined, but a family nonetheless. But as they were loading supplies into the wagon, a man approached them. He was dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dusty Wyoming town. He was handsome, with a smooth, charming smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Pardon me," the man said, his voice cultured, Eastern. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did I hear the name Sullivan? Rose Sullivan?" "Who's asking?" Jack said, his hand moving to rest on the axe handle propped against the wagon wheel. The man's smile widened. "My name is Charles Hartley. I've been looking for Rose for some time. You see, a terrible misunderstanding separated us. I've just come into a considerable inheritance, and I've come to find her and my child." He looked at the bundle on Jack's chest. His smile was that of a wolf who had just cornered a lamb. "I believe," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing whisper, "that you have my son.